Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I believe you've all been let into the session now. It's 1:30 and we're just about to get started. So welcome, everyone. I'm Rosemary McLean, one of the NICEC Fellows, and I'm delighted to have you here today on this really interesting topic, which is all about looking at labour market information, moving from information to insights. It's really about how we're going to help practitioners think differently, perhaps, about the labour market information that's around us. I'm really looking forward to this session. I'm going to be trying to keep us all on time, sort of segue between the sessions, and we've got a great team of contributors today. So these sessions at the cutting edge are a collaboration between the CDI and NICEC, and the idea behind them is always to try and help practitioners in particular think about practice in relation to new insights and new research. That's really what we're all about. And this is what we've got planned for today. We've got a number of sessions in mind. So we're going to kick off with Wendy Hirsch and Emma Pollard, who are going to kick us off. We're going to have a breakout session in that section. And then we're going to have Charlie Ball talking about moving from information into intelligence to insights, that sort of making sense of the information. Then we're going to have a break. And then after that, we've got a great session from Keith Herman on really interesting topic on looking at the politics of labour market information and the bias that comes in. And then at the end, we're going to do some more breakouts and have a plenary and a sort of more open session. And then we'll finish at 4:30. And what we're going to do now is actually kick off with a poll, because obviously with Zoom calls, you never know who's in the room until we get sort of maybe cameras on and everyone can see each other. So this poll is really just a great way of just finding out who's in the room, what sort of work you do, how this is relevant to you. So we're going to launch the poll now. We are forcing you to pick one option of, which is the careers work that you're mostly involved in. We realize that many of you are doing lots of different types of work with different types of people, but just to give us a sense of what's the predominant audience that you're involved in. I should have said in my introduction, I'm very much a practitioner, and I actually work though with organizations as much as individuals, helping them really think about the sort of work they're doing around careers as a driver for talent retention, engagement, productivity, and the rest of it, but also work with individuals as well. So I think we've got people voting away. Just give you a couple of seconds longer to do that. Perhaps we'll broadcast the results now so everyone could see what everyone's doing. Great, so that's really interesting. There's a very large number of proportions of people working, 69% of you working in careers work in educational settings. I think that's what is the top one there. So that's really interesting with and with young people. So great, that's good to know. Thank you very much. So we'll just take the poll down now, and then we'll get started. So we'll end that poll. Right. So without further ado, then I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to now pass to Wendy Hirsch and Emma Pollard, who are going to take us into the first session. So Wendy and Emma, I'll let you introduce yourselves and we'll get started. Just need to unmute yourselves. Yeah, great.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Lovely to be here today, and thanks, Rosemary. So in this first session, Emma Pollard and I are just going to get us all thinking about labour market information in a general way. Just to introduce ourselves very briefly, we both work with the Institute for Employment Studies, IES, which perhaps unusually, as an independent centre, works both on policy issues, nationally, regionally, but also with employers. So we sort of see labour market information from both sides. And our director, Tony Wilson, has been particularly influential of late, advising government on what's really happening to the labour market during COVID. myself, Wendy Hirsch, I work mostly with or for employers on career issues, but also on workforce planning. So I have to think a lot about how people get into the organisation, how they move around it, how they leave, but also what the labour competitors are of an organisation I'm working with, and more generally, what kind of work there is there. So labour market information in its broadest sense is really rather important in my work. And I'll just hand over to Emma to say a quick hello as well.
Thanks, Wendy. So I'm Emma Pollard and I'm at IES as well. And I work mostly in the policy space. So my kind of areas of research really are about the pathways from education into the labour market, particularly from higher education, and then the sort of decision making that surrounds that and the development of careers, so navigation of the labour market.
Thanks, Emma. So in approaching our session, we've got a few things on our minds. Perhaps most importantly, how very contextual the need for labour market information is, how different users really are addressing different questions, and particularly users who are receiving career guidance. While there are many sources of labour market information, and the standard sources we look to often are good to understand the general labour market, but they're not really set up for career guidance. And often they don't tell you what you want to know, which means that we all need to be rather imaginative, but also critical searchers for and users of labour market information. We're going to address 4 topics. Emma is going to do the first 2 around what we mean by labour market information and useful sources. So over to you, Emma.
Thanks, Wendy. So if we go on to the first slide with words on, lovely. So what is LMI? And I'm sort of coming at it from a certain perspective as a social researcher. So what does it mean for me? So firstly, the sort of the LM bit, the labour market aspect. So it's just recognising that it is a labour market. So it's a market, so it involves both supply and demand, but also the interaction between the two. So from supply side, we're often looking at individuals as labour market actors and the skills that they bring and the markers of those skills, which are often qualifications. So in the work that I do, I'm often looking at graduates, those leaving HE, and the volume and nature and profile of these. But the work of my colleagues at IES, supply relates to different things. So it relates to looking for jobs, looking at levels of economic activity of individuals in the population. So those that are already employed or unemployed and looking for work, or those that aren't in the labour market and looking to return to work, such as women returners. It also covers demand for labour, so that's often indicated by vacancies or skills that are in demand, but also pay as a sort of market price of labour. So demand can be measured and assessed in a number of different ways, from direct surveys of employers asking what they're doing around vacancies and recruitment, through to indirect sources such as the numbers of workers in jobs, but also future projections of employment by occupation. And also the interaction between the two is quite interesting as well. The sort of balance between supply and demand, and whether supply and demand meet. So from my perspective, when I'm thinking about graduates, it's about, do the number of graduates equal the number of vacancies that are looking for graduates? And it's also about how the supply is deployed. So what jobs, again, from my perspective, are graduates doing? So we can have unmet demand, which can be talked about in terms of sort of skill shortages. So there are vacancies that can't be filled or are difficult to be filled. There's also skills gaps. So where there's a sort of gap in the proficiency, so people aren't able to operate to the degree that they're required in their jobs. But then there's also skills mismatches, and that's sometimes when we talk about underemployment or overemployment, or underqualification, overqualification. And then also that the labour market sits within this sort of wider context where factors can influence the market. So that can be things like technology influencing the types of jobs and skills required, or recession, recovery, or the changes in the size or the age or composition of the workforce, and also government policy, which is again the kind of the things that I particularly look at, and education policy in particular. So more recently, it's about the encouraging of vocational pathways, so the focus on apprenticeships, and also the bringing back of the focus on lifelong learning and reskilling. So a key thing for me about the labour market bit is that there's two parts really, the demand and the supply, that they don't operate in isolation, and they're dynamic and they change in response to these wider drivers and trends. And then the I bit, so that can mean information, so sort of the basic data, facts or statistics, or it can mean intelligence or insight, providing some commentary or interpretation or critique or analysis of the information. But at the heart of LMI is data. So LMI is about the collection, access, publication, and potentially also analysis and interpretation of these data. And for me, I feel that it's important to use a range of data and commentary from trusted sources to give me a really rounded picture of the demand and supply. And it helps me to focus in on what I want to know. And I was thinking about the uses of LMI because it's powerful and I find it particularly interesting. So I think it can be used to support decision making. So for individuals or companies or policy, it can help improve understanding of issues and problems and potential solutions. And it also can provide the context for wider exploration, research and evaluation. And sources can be raw data, so the current picture, trends, how we got here, and projections, what things might look like, commentary and interpretation of these data, or ideally both. So moving on to think about sort of some of the dimensions of labour market information. So I was trying to think of all the different things that it means to me in terms of what I need to think about when I'm thinking about choosing the right data or measures. So you have things like data type, dates and currency, frequency of collection, the time frame and focus, the scope and coverage. I find that's particularly important in terms of, is there anything missing in terms of who I think should be covered? Snapshot or movement, are we looking at a snapshot on time, or are we looking at trends over time? Geography, that often catches me out in terms of, am I just looking at England only, or is it GB, or is it the UK? And units of analysis are particularly key. So sort of what type of thing are we interested in? So for me, it's often graduates, so it's people. And for example, when I'm thinking about the dimensions and thinking of the work that I do, say, for example, I wanted to answer the question, how many graduates are there to understand supply? I'd need numbers, so hard numbers, and I'd need something current because the pattern changes all the time. And then I need to think about, do I want to know about all graduates, or is it just undergraduates or postgraduates? Do I care whether they're full or part-time, or they can be any mode of study? I'm interested in all subjects or specific subjects. I am interested in those who studied in the UK only, or those who studied internationally, or those who are from the UK, or those who are from other countries. Am I interested in those who studied in public funded universities or private universities, or those who studied in an FE college, or all of the above? And do I want to know about those emerging from HE, so the new graduates? If so, how long counts as new? And also, am I thinking more about how many graduates there are in the labour market that have a degree? So they're all the things that go through my mind when I'm thinking about that answer to that one simple question. And the other thing that I find interesting is that there are definitions and categories that are quite important in LMI, and they're not always agreed, so they sometimes can be contested. So for example, a graduate job is not necessarily a category or definition that is widely accepted. There is a key definition that's often used, which is the IER definition, which is based on occupation. But also these categories change over time, but they don't necessarily change as quickly as the things that they are attempting to measure, and also that they can overlap. So some of the key definitions and categories that I look at and that like the heart of LMI are occupations and jobs, and there's a hierarchy within this. So there's a value judgment around occupations within this classification that require more skill or more training than others. You have sectors and employers that are classified. We have classifications for qualifications, and again there's a hierarchy involved. And interestingly, qualifications, the classifications involved differ according to the different UK nations, so there are variations in the classifications used. And skills is an interesting one as well, because that is one of the hardest things to classify. So people talk about hard skills, soft skills, specific or generic skills, complex skills or basic skills, etc. So there are various aspects to the categories and definitions that we use. And as I said, one of the things that I find quite interesting is that these often overlap. So for example, if I was trying to talk about engineering, am I talking about engineering jobs, or am I talking about engineering companies, or am I talking about engineering jobs and engineering companies? Or am I talking about engineering skills? So, for example, my husband's a design engineer, so his occupation is an engineer, but he mainly works in the construction sector. So, moving on to think now about some sources. Thanks, Wendy. So, I've put together a few thoughts around the sources of LMI that I go to and Wendy goes to, and our wider colleagues at IES as well. So this first set is about sources for employment and skills. So where we might go to for data, but also this sort of the commentary, the insight and the intelligence around employment and skills. And really the key source for me is the Office for National Statistics and the related service, which is the NOMIS service provided by ONS. But we and other organisations, so IES, produce monthly briefings based on the ONS statistics, but also organisations like Learning Work Institute, IER and Resolution Foundation, and IFS also produce insights based on these data, but also wider data too. And we have organisations like CIPD who also produce the quarterly labour market outlook, and theirs is based on surveys of employers that they undertake. And then you have other organisations like the Institute for Student Employers who do work based on their membership. CBI also do work. You have the Employer Skills Survey, which is another good source of information about skills requirement and that skills mismatch. And then you have other sources that look beyond the UK and provide a benchmark for the UK, so OECD and Eurostat. And then the next slide, that covers some of the sources that that I use and colleagues use, specifically in relation to education, learners and skills. So for me, the two key ones are sources of data and information are HESA, and they produce lots of statistics around students, graduates and graduate outcomes, and also performance indicators for the UK HE sector. They produce this data and tables, but also statistical briefings and reports around those. And DFE, which covers a much wider range of education data, so not just higher education, so schools all the way through to adult and community learning, and FE along the way. And DFE have a wide range of statistics that they bring together, and they also have the Exploring Education Statistics searchable database as well, where you can manipulate the data and create tables for yourself in terms of getting the kinds of combinations of data you want. And other sources are listed there in terms of, so that you can see there's a slight bias towards my interest, which is higher education. So you have UCAS, Advanced HE and Office for Students that produce lots of data and their own bespoke surveys. But also Prospects, who produce really good insights based on the HESA data. And then you have organisations like the Association of Colleges that gives a bit more information about the FE sector. And I've put on there as well LEO, which is the longitudinal education outcomes data and briefings that relate to that, which is a more recent development. And that's allowing more longitudinal tracking of what happens to individuals, links their education through to data from Treasury and also from the Department for Work and Pensions to look at the work that people do and how it links to their education status and how that changes over time. And then you've also got market research in this space as well. So, for example, you've got the high flyers who do a survey of employers, and that feeds into the Times top 100 graduate employers, for example. And then the next slide, just to remind myself really that I mustn't forget about professional bodies and learned societies and sector bodies who provide really good compilations of statistics on a focused sector or profession. So they're really good go-to sources. And also local and regional bodies, because they do provide, again, that compilation of information, statistics and insights relating to a particular locality. And there's some just examples of the kinds of organisations that I meant by professional bodies and learned societies. And then if I've got time, Wendy, do I have time?
Yes. Yes,
I was just going to say the final slide I've got here is just to give some examples of some of the work that I've done recently that have involved labour market information. So I did a project for a global engineering company, Atkins, who wanted to understand why some groups progress in their careers in engineering and others from underrepresented groups don't really progress in their careers, and what's the extent of what they called this deflection. And then how long it would take for diversity groups to catch up to the majority group. So the problems we faced were in relation to this work was related to the definitions, really. What did we mean by engineering? So was it engineering jobs or companies? What diversity groups could we find the data for? And what measures did we want to use to signify progress? So we tried the labour force survey, which is looks at stocks, and we tried understanding society, which tracks people over time, so it looks at flows. And we were able to do analysis by gender and ethnicity and disability, but what we really needed was much more detailed data captured by companies, because the dashboard data was really too clunky to really understand this deflection that we were looking at. And another project was for the construction sector, who wanted to understand what attracted people to work in construction and what could attract them and what does or could put them off. So they wanted to understand the views of those who are already in construction and those who've been there for a while and those who are new entrants, also those who aren't in construction but perhaps could be persuaded to attracted to construction. So those in related industries such as manufacturing, but also those that are really unrelated sectors such as retail. So we found that there was really no widely available labour market information or intelligence around these particular issues, therefore we needed to take sort of bespoke research to truly understand that. So it's just how sometimes there are limitations in terms of the labour market information and intelligence that's around there. So it's a quick whiz through, and over to you now, Wendy.
Thanks, Emma. And on that last one, I think even if you've worked with the labour market information for many years, there are always surprises. And in the study of construction, we were terribly interested by what people who had worked in the sector thought about it, compared with people who hadn't. And some really positive aspects of the sector emerged, particularly around the flexibility of careers that was people's lived experience of working in that sector. So, you know, even if, like Emma, you've worked with labour market information for a long time, your guesses are not always right. And you can tell from her enthusiasm, she just loves this stuff. So I'll address a second set of topics now. One is about obtaining labour market information from employers. And then I'm going to talk a bit about being a critical consumer of labour market information. I think, as Emma has already hinted, we do often end up, all of us, including your clients, having to think about what employers and employees can tell us. I've called them workers on this slide because it includes people in self-employment, for example, not just informal employee type employment. And one of the reasons we often have to reach for other sources is that much of what you need to know and the individuals you work with is both specific and tacit. It's specific in the sense that it's often about an occupation or a location or even an employer. And it's tacit in the sense that it's not recorded formally anywhere. It's very fast changing, as Emma has already highlighted. It may be on the move. And that is not what large scale sources are set up for, although sometimes if you're lucky, you can find a specific research study that someone's been done, but seldom in the academic literature. Academic literature doesn't help us that much, I don't think, with labour market information. It's often not asking the same questions that you would be asking. And again, coming back to Emma's reminder, employers, of course, are also behind the scenes in both professional bodies and sectoral bodies and local partnerships. So another way of getting at the employer view is via those bodies that Emma mentioned just now. And websites are useful too. Glassdoor is where employees can give feedback on employers. LinkedIn is an interesting source about companies, but also about key people in companies. So particularly if you're going to contact somebody or if you're going to be seeing somebody, it doesn't take a second just to look them up and find out something about them. You'll see my horse's mouth cartoon there. What we're talking about here is really how do you get to talk to people who know about that kind of work or education. The same applies to finding students who are studying the things if you're somebody working with younger people. But I'd just like to highlight the last point on this slide, that term employer rather hides who you're talking to. So much as I love HR managers and work with them all the time, often they don't know the most about jobs in the organisation in terms of what it would be like to do those jobs. Recruitment people might, line managers have great insights, and so do employees at different career stages. And often I think a person really needs to talk to someone just a bit further on from them. But if you want a real overview of an organisation, then you do probably want to talk to somebody further on in their career or higher up who has a wider perspective. Just a quick glance on 2 slides. I think you'll get the slides later from CDI of what we might want to ask about. And the first block I've got here is just a general understanding of the setup in an employing organisation. And if you or the people you work with get a chance to talk to employers or employees, I think often we skimp this bit of just finding out how it works generally from an employment point of view. I'd also add that employers love to be asked about their business. You know, that's what they're interested in. And so jumping straight in and asking a lot about recruitment before you've shown any interest in what they do is not necessarily a bright idea. So the sort of general things I would look at is, first of all, I'd always read an annual report and look at their website before I talk to anyone. And I think your clients should learn to do the same. What do they do? What do they make? What services do they sell? What's changing there? And roughly, how many people do they employ? What's affecting them? I like a really open question like, how are things? Or how is business? Which gives them a chance to mention the kinds of things that are important to them. And if there are changes going on, so at the moment with the economy, for example, or with particular things happening to trade and services and post-Brexit, what's that doing to the kinds of people they're employing? How it's affecting employment, and whether they're alike or different from other people in their sector. I think sectors are really important to understand, and often you'll get a whole sector moving in the same way, but sometimes not. Sometimes an organisation will be pursuing a very different strategy from its business competitors. The thing that's most important to understand, I think, are the main groups of jobs and people they have, with emphasis on that word group. As Emma said, official statistics are in terms of occupation. And occupation in that formal sense is often not how employers think about jobs. So just to give you an example, I've been working recently with some colleagues with a London council, a borough, on the difficulty of staffing their adult social care and public health directorate. Social workers, that's easy. We know what a social worker looks like. Public health, actually much less easy, quite complicated public health. And that's where I had to do homework with the professional bodies, because there are more than one, to figure out how it really works. Getting a degree in public health doesn't guarantee you're qualified. And then people who commission social care for adults. Not a profession or a function in the sense that you don't need a fixed qualification, but commissioning social care, that's placing contracts with care homes, for example, and other providers, is a distinct occupation, but one that's changing, of course, as all these occupations are. And I often think what you really want to get at is, what would it feel like to do that job for a day? And particularly, I think if you get a chance to talk to employees, that's what you're likely to want to ask. Pay and conditions you'll be familiar with, but also workplace culture is very important to ask about in terms of what it's like to work somewhere. The kinds of people that work there and how diverse they are, you may be interested in. And I think the last question on this slide is a good one. What do your staff, or what do your colleagues, if you're talking to an employee, like about working here and the work, or not like quite so much? Getting down to the stuff you probably think about a lot, you know, how people enter, roughly how many come in, whether there are any training schemes, which jobs are popular, where are there shortages. Skills, I think, again, the word skills I use in a rather generic sense with employers. It covers knowledge, skills, it also covers experience. It can often cover attitudes these days, or values. Organizations are interested in people's values, or personal attributes in the sense of their enthusiasms and interests. What do they look for, both generally and in a job specific sense? What do they find missing from the people who apply for jobs is a good question to ask. Gives you a clue about what to big up when people are applying. And then the recruitment process, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. Where do they advertise? But also, how do they shortlist and what do they test for? Will any applicants need to do a video, for example, as well as the final selection? Links with education can be important to understand. Work experience, I'm sure you're interested in, and how it can be accessed. And then I think people often forget to ask, what happens once I'm in? You know, once I'm in, how do things work? How do I go on getting training and development? So that's a very quick gallop through things to ask about employers. I just want to say a few things about being a critical user to finish our segment, and then we'll go into breakouts. I think my first message is, please do not repeat things that are just made up. So I cannot tell you. Sorry?
So I can go through my.
Someone's got their microphone on, I think. I cannot tell you how often people have told me that we'll change our career 5 or 7 times during our working lives. Entirely made up. A career professional called Dawn Rosenberg dug around in America. I've tried digging around myself. We think that figure may have come from the American Department of Labor, but it wasn't ever a figure of people changing jobs. It was possibly a figure of people changing careers. And in fact, they don't collect data on the number of time people really change the kinds of work they do, which is what changing your career would mean to me. So just don't say it if it's just made up. And then I've given an example of a rather naff cover of a professional bodies journal. Actually, CIPD is a fabulous professional body, but you know, within 12 years, half the workforce will be freelance. I'll show you something about that in a minute. The picture of the woman doing yoga on the beach is just because for some reason, websites that talk about career change always have pictures of women doing yoga on the beach. Sometimes a moody man staring out across the savannah. I found one of those too. People talk about rising trends of less secure work a lot. This is a chart of self-employment as a percentage of everyone in work. It's gone up and down over the years. It's gone up a bit. But actually, if you look right back over 30 years and more, it's gone up from rather under 12% to about 13% and is lower now than it was in 2016. So these things go up and down. It doesn't always mean when they go up a bit, there's some massive rise. People talk about portfolio careers. ONS published data of people with a second job. That means they're employed twice. That's much smaller than self-employment and really hasn't gone up over 30 years at all. It's wiggled around sort of high 3% to sometimes 4%. So that's not, it's wiggling. That's a technical term, wiggling around a small percentage. Look at the numbers carefully. I think working out who's coming and leaving work and the workforce around Brexit, all this sort of Polish lorry driver stuff, there are people producing useful analysis, not just figures. So the first example I've got here is a very recent IES briefing, which are free on the website. You can get them very easily. With, in some ways, the big pandemic story is about people who've left the workforce. We thought we were going to have huge unemployment. What we actually have is people who've given up work, and particularly older people who've given up work, and also people who are long-term sick. For those in employment, we have a very tight labour market. We have nearly the same number of vacancies as we have unemployed people looking for work, but we still have long-term unemployment. So that's the sort of picture that people who do this for you can offer. And being a lazy person myself, I think going to the analysis that someone else has taken the trouble to do is a good move. The second example on that slide is from a very interesting Learning and Work Institute report called Fast Forward, again, available free, looking at people moving sectors. And we hear a lot about career change. It's interesting that the number of people changing from one sector to another has actually fallen in recent years. It fell a little again in the pandemic, but the more interesting trend is that after the last recession it fell, and it hasn't really fully recovered. So not everyone is jumping from one sector to another. My current interest is in whether we do or don't have a great resignation. That again has become a thing from America. I found an interesting article in The Guardian, but referring to a study that was tantalizing because it didn't tell me what I wanted to know. It was a survey of 6,000 people done by a recruitment firm, but however hard I clicked, I couldn't get to the bottom of who those 6,000 people were. And I think they may have been people on the books of the recruitment firm, but they don't say that. So the very high numbers looking for a job, which seemed to me dubious, I just could not get to the bottom of it, however hard I clicked. We're now beginning to find out that it may be that the Great Resignation was just people who couldn't move in 2020 deciding to move in 2021. You'll see the numbers there at the top of the slide. Fewer people moved in 2020 than 2019. And in some ways, the numbers in 2021 were just the people who would have moved anyway. But we've now got a bit of data from ONS that shows there may be a bit of an upturn in people moving job, but it's a bit too early to tell. So sometimes you just can't really get to the bottom, but you just have to click a bit harder. So just to finish our input session here before the breakout, I think you just click a bit more. You click once or twice more, not for hours, but just once or twice, checking who's telling me, what time period we're looking at, where in the world it's from. If it's American, you know, just think twice. What sort of jobs and people, what sample is it based on? If you see a number, is it big or small as a proportion of what you're interested in? And is it going up and down? And if it's going up or down, how quickly is it really going up or down? And look over a period if you can. I'm just going to move you now into breakout groups. So we'll have, I hope, a moment for questions later, and if not, at the end of the afternoon. But you're going to go now into breakout groups, small groups, to talk about the 4 questions here. Pick the ones that are of most interest to you. The first 2 are really about need. What do you need to understand? And what do your clients need to understand? And the second 2 are really about how you find using labour market information. Are there some you find very useful? And are there some that are difficult to find and or hard to understand? And in your groups, do feel free to pick. We'll try and paste in to the chat the questions I can't see on my screen, but if you just take a note of them, what you need, what your clients need, what you find useful, what may be more problematic for you. At the end of the time, we're going to ask you just to paste into the chat bar when you get back to the plenary some responses to those questions. So we're going to send you off now and get you back in about 1/4 of an hour or very slightly more. So perhaps CDI can send us. I'll stop sharing. Right, is everyone back now, Ashley? And we've got Rosemary back.
Yeah, I ended up in a group, which was very nice. I wasn't expecting to be in a group, but that was lovely.
So I hope you all had really good conversations. With so many of you here today, I typed the questions in the chat, and it would be great if you wouldn't mind typing something in there from each group. And we will edit the chat after the event to feed back what you said. Someone said there was something in there. Great. So if you continue to do that, I'm not sure Charlie is here, Rosemary. So we'll go to Keith if Charlie.
No, he is. He is.
No, I am quite sure I'm
he's
here.
appeared.
Yeah,
Great.
Yeah, he is here.
Just for a minute or two then, just to finish off that session, if there's anything anyone would like to voice, Rosemary will spot you and bring you in if there's anyone moved to speak at this point, or to pick up any questions from Emma's input or mine earlier.
Well, if you go to reactions on the panel below, you can raise a hand. So if you're really feel you would love to say something, now's your chance. So if you raise your hand, if you want to comment. I would imagine the discussion would have been quite interesting, Wendy, with people from different sectors and different contexts, because your needs around labour market intelligence, I guess, vary a bit about what's appropriate and what you're bringing in at different stages. I don't know if that came up as a theme. Anyone? Oh, yeah, Helen's raised her hand. So Helen, would you like to speak? Helen Suffolk.
Hi.
Adams. Yeah.
Just a couple of things really, and one of the things that came up for us is to do with things that you find very difficult to find, but basically I'm going to aim mine, if I may, at the lady that was really fascinated, Emma, to do with HE. I love labour market, and I do try and find out lots of information so I can give it up to date and relevant, but constantly, and I know this is the same with all research, but you know, on a week-by-week basis, I can get 2 very diametrically opposing views on whether we've got too many students at university, too few courses, the wrong types of courses, the wrong kind of employers, whether we should be encouraging people to go to university still or discouraging them to do it. How do you reconcile all that with yourself?
I think that's a really good question. And yeah, that there are so many different views, and you kind of get a sense of certain people are in certain camps. And I think it's, for me, it's trying to understand what data they are drawing from and what are their arguments for these two different approaches. And often it relates to how you define a graduate and how you define a graduate job, and that these things are movable and they change. And I know Charlie's got his hand up because he's probably got a very good answer here as well.
All I'm going to say is somebody really ought to have written a paper or something very recently through Universities UK that lays out all the basic data. Oh wait, that was me. In fact, it only came out 2 weeks ago. If you go to Universities UK and look at the paper that I wrote for them on myths about the graduate labour market, you'll see some basic laying out of many of the core issues behind a lot of the questions that you lay out. It's actually an abridged version of a much longer, much more detailed piece that I wrote, which hopefully we'll get out later. They are important questions, but there's a lot of disinformation. There's a lot of obscuring of the basic facts, and the fundamental issue is really actually, as Emma said, what a graduate actually is and what is commonly felt to be a graduate are often two different things. And also, we don't have brilliant demand side data on skills demand. In fact, to be honest, the sector can't even agree on what a skill is. So that makes demand side data we've got brilliant data on supply, but because we don't have great demand data, it's very difficult for anybody to definitively say how and where that data, those two sides match up. What I'll do is I'll put the paper in. I'll put the paper in the chat if anybody wants.
Thanks, Charlie, and of course you're going to be speaking in a minute, so we'll hear from you very shortly. I think John Morrison had his hand up. I don't know if, John, that moment has passed, or whether you still had a point you wanted to share. I see you just put something in the chat, but did you want to speak as well, John?
Yeah, no, it was just what our thoughts from the.
Do put your camera on so we can see you.
I was trying to, but it says you cannot start your video because the host has stopped it. So I have been trying. Sorry.
Oh, right.
Well,
okay.
Another time.
Well, maybe Ashley in the background can sort that out.
No, it was just following up in terms of because we're kind of working with young people, and I guess it's difficult to find resources sometimes, but it's been really beneficial to have packages or resources which are accessible, which can disseminate the information quite straightforward to students to get them in terms of having a hook to what their course is and start to explore possibilities, but also for their parents and carers to be on board, because they have obviously they're quite a good influence on the young person as well as staff. So we use things like obviously like prospects, but also we've got a package called Unifrog, which just gives us that sort of the meat in terms of what their college courses where I'm based can then progress on to. But yeah, it's quite a tricky thing to get the right sort of LMI or what you're trying to get them to do at certain times of the year. And hopefully, that LMI is going to inform our provision and, when to put on events and what's the sort of people we need to reach out to help with things like just understanding where jobs are going to be in the local labour market.
Yes, thank you. And there's some interesting questions in the chat. The theme seems to be, that there's a lot out there, but it's sort of picking your way through it, which is, I guess, what Emma and I were saying too. And I think for one of the important aspects of careers education for us is to help people understand that labour market information isn't a fixed thing. It is a sort of exploratory thing. And maybe I sometimes wonder if people are a bit too nervous and think, well, I might go to the wrong website, or I think helping people acquire the sort of inquisitiveness you heard from Emma, and to feel that they are entitled to explore and to explore different sources, I think was the message we were keen to get across, and then learn to know whether a source is likely to be reliable. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your conversations, and we'll have more questions at the end. So back to Rosemary now to move us
thanks,
on.
Wendy. Yeah, I think by the time we get to the latter part of the session, there'll be probably some themes that are emerging that we can all have a good debate about. But no, want to now pass over to Charlie, who I mean, one of the things I'm struck by all this is in particularly when Emma, you were sharing all the sources, you know, how potentially overwhelming it is, as we've already said. You know, where do you start? And if you're a busy practitioner, where do you start? And actually what's relevant to your clients at any time anyways varies, as we've said. So I think it is a challenge for practitioners, and I experience it as well when I'm working in organizations. It's much more about, you know, the internal labor market in those organizations and the sector that I'm looking at. So Charlie, I'm hoping you can help us make sense of this, because you're going to be focusing a little bit on how you what turns information into insight in what you do with it, I think. So
that's exactly what I'm going to do.
That's what I'm hoping. So over to you, Charlie. And then we're running a little bit behind, Charlie. So I'll be keeping an eye on time.
Try and bring this back onto schedule.
Thank you very much.
People have got many things to do. So right, I'll just make sure I can say, am I doing sharing?
Yes.
I will do sharing then. Let's just go here. Let's try that. That might work. Oh yes. Right, can we all see that? That's a PowerPoint presentation, as is traditional for these things. Good. Right, so I'm going to talk a little bit, and I'm going to try and get this done quite quickly. I'm not going to do what I'm, for those of you who are familiar with me in the way that I normally do a presentation here, I'm going to give you very little data. I'm going to talk very little about the state of the graduate labour market. It's impossible to follow Wendy and Emma on things like that. They're just way better at all of it than I am. And Wendy, anyway, I was just watching Wendy presentation with a mixture of mouth horror and admiration at how neatly and succinctly she did everything. But my role is somewhat different within the sector. I'll talk about that in a minute. I'll talk a little bit about myself first. I'm actually a scientist by training. I'm an analytical chemist. My doctorate is in 4-sector tandem mass spectrometry, which probably means very little to most of you, thank goodness. It's actually a shortage area, and there are very few people who studied it, and we don't have enough people who do it. So there are times when I feel slightly guilty about going into the labour market analysis, but there aren't enough people who do that either. So at least I am going from shortage area to shortage area. I've been a labour market specialist for nearly 20 years. But people do think it's a rather odd change to have gone from operating, you know, from doing really quite complex analysis using quite complicated kits, some of which I built myself, to doing this kind of work on data and information in what appears to be an entirely different field. But actually, all of my training and the things that I'm good at least the things I think I'm good at, have been analysis, interpretation, dissemination of complex data sets. I've done a few other things in between, but it's always been taking large, complicated data sets and trying to explain the relevance and value of them to an informed lay audience, usually. So I've been doing this on labour market information for nearly 20 years. There aren't very many of us. By us, there are not very many labour market specialists in the UK. There are not very many people who work solely on the labour market and labour market information. And there are very few with the level of experience that I have. So I'm in quite a fortunate position in having been able to allow to build a kind of body of expertise and work over the last 2 decades without too much interference or interruption. So I currently work for JISC, who are the sector body in higher education, well, higher and further education, charged with the support of career specialists and other organised, where we basically sector support for all sorts of things. But I work mainly with careers specialists, but also increasingly administrators. Because of JISC position, this actually involves everything a post-18 education leaver might do. So I do quite a lot on postgraduate options and even the other things, volunteering, work experience, even travel, that a post-18 education leaver might do. Also, and I did mention this in the breakout rooms, Because I do a lot of work on what people do with their qualifications, I actually also work quite a lot with admissions. I also work quite a lot with schools, because obviously if you want to make an informed decision about what you want to do at college or university, it's a good idea to have some idea about what somebody might do with the qualifications you're looking at. So I do quite a lot of work with schools. On particular specialisms, if people are interested, at local labour markets, classification systems, because I'm a massive nerd, and also things to do with postgrads, but mainly in those three areas because few people do them. So the bar to being considered an expert is quite low. So I can pass myself off as being very good at this sort of thing because I have few people who will challenge me. As you can probably guess, and I'll be quite candid about this up front, I do sometimes feel quite sheepish about the fact that I haven't formally trained in these areas. Imposter syndrome is a constant companion with me on this journey. As we go through, you're all proper. I look at this group and I think you're all proper careers people, and here am I, a bearded nerd who trained to do chemistry, daring to tell you how to use information and insight. But I comfort myself with the fact that, you know, I have been doing this for quite a while and I've got reasonably good at it, and hopefully you will find what I say useful and interesting. I do have a relatively unusual role even within labour market specialists. I'm not an academic as such. Technically I could be considered one. I have a fellowship, but I don't really do academia. I don't really do research either, and not in the way that I would consider it, having been an academic as an academic scientist. I don't do research. I don't produce a lot of primary information of my own. I do a little bit of it, but in the way that Emma, for example, does a great deal of research and is unquestionably one of, if not the best in the field at it, I don't really do that sort of thing very often. I actually normally parasitize on the back of other people's work, nick their data, and then do cool things with it. But my job is, I'm one of the few people who's kind of a broker between those two worlds. So I take the complex, interesting, difficult information that people like Emma and Wendy produce, and I try to help turn that into things that you can use with your clients and with your students. And so I have kind of a foot in both worlds. So I do an awful lot. So most of my job is analysis, but the most important thing for my job, and the thing that I go by, is none of this data is useful if you can't use it. And I don't mean me, I can use it. None of this data is useful if you, the audience, cannot use it. And it is my job to turn it into things that you can use. So that's where I sit within kind of the ecosystem of careers and information. So I'm going to talk to you about a particular challenge we faced as an illustration of how my process works. I feel like a jobbing actor saying that, how my process works. And I'm going to talk about a fairly obscure thing that happened relatively recently that caused a bit of disruption to the information environment. It was a thing called COVID. Don't know if any of you remember that, because apparently we're all supposed to consider it over, although it is still ongoing. But actually, I'm going to use COVID as an example of the way that it made me and the way that it helped me think in a very clear way about what it is that I do, how it is that I do it, and what it is that I can do and people like me can do to help you more effectively. So, aside from all the other things that COVID did, it caused an exceptional level of economic disruption. Again, if you want to take a look at some of the definitive work on the disruption it caused, then you would do very well to look at the work of the Institute of Employment Studies, Emma's organisation, who've done some absolutely brilliant examinations of how COVID affected the economy and the labour market. But what was notable was that the rate of change was beyond anything we'd seen before. So ordinarily, if you see a recession normally takes 2 or 3 years to build up, 2 or 3 years to eventuate, and 2 or 3 years to recover from. That was what happened in the 2008-2009 recession. We saw it coming actually a long way away. It was nearly 2 years after people started queuing at Northern Rock before we were actually officially in recession and the labour market really started to hit. And the labour market didn't actually hit bottom until 3 years after the recession had begun. With COVID, that was all compressed into timescales of at best months, and in some cases weeks. Quite extraordinary. And of course, the labour market was one of the most affected parts of the economy because, you know, we and most of the developed countries in the world effectively shut down. So there was an awful lot happening in different ways in different sectors. Now, in my particular area, in the graduate sector, normally, and for many years, in fact, 50 years previously, we had what's called DELI, the Destination of Leavers of Higher Education, or one of its previous incarnations, First Destination Survey, Destination of Leavers Survey, and so on, all the way back to the early 60s, which took graduates after 6 months and asked them what they were doing. But as a result of changes that the sector had made 2 years previously, that data had gone out to 15, that survey data had gone out to 15 months, which means that we have not yet got that data for graduates who graduated in the pandemic. We're going to get it next month. So we still don't actually know what happened to graduates. We have some ideas, but we don't know what happened to graduates when it was in the past, in previous recessions. Despite the flaws in the data set, we did actually generally then tend to get a fairly detailed picture quite quickly of what happened to education leavers fairly rapidly in events like this. But also, I think the key factor that we had, the real game changer, was social media. Social media means bad information can spread as easily as good information, and bad information often has better marketing and branding. So we had a massive challenge. People were getting all sorts of terrible, terrible information. There were some exceptionally poor takes on the likely fate of the economy right at the outset. As a labour market specialist, the very first thing that happened in my job was I got all my usual media contacts phoning me up in late February saying what's going to happen. And then I would disappoint them by saying, I don't know what's going to happen. This is entirely new. We have no stars to chart us by. I was ready to start telling them in May, but by that point, all the spicy hot takes had been given, with me trying to fix mistakes that some others who jumped the gun a little bit more readily had made. The information environment changed very quickly. What was really interesting was actually, we've been talking for quite some time about the idea of real-time labour market information, this kind of idea that there was some magic formula by which you could actually tap into what was going on in the jobs market as it was happening. It was an illusion. It's always been an illusion. It's not doable. You can very roughly divide labour market information into two different kinds. There is timely labour market information and there is accurate labour market information, but there is not both, depending on your timescales of timely. However, what we now have is we have much better rapid labour market information, and organisations, and in fact two particular organisations I felt did an exceptional job. Adzuna, who work with who work powering the government's own job sites, and indeed the large private sector multinational organisation, both really rose to the challenge. They both make their data, their raw data, freely available to be interrogated. Adzuna has gone into basically their data is they produce their data after a week, so we can have a really good idea of the state of large parts of the UK job market now a week after they've happened, which I think is about the best we're going to get. Indeed, have a more multinational remit. They're especially useful for parts of the country that are not always very well covered. So Indeed's data on Northern Ireland, for example, is very good. It's actually also very good for the Republic of Ireland, for anybody who works in that area. And I actually do some work with Ireland as well. So those two organisations in particular rose to the challenge. And what I particularly like about them is, firstly, they make their data freely available. And secondly, they are candid about the limitations of their own data. They don't say this is the definitive take. They do say this is what we say, this is what we get, but you have to bear in mind that our sources have biases. So that's really, really handy. Again, as I say, I'm making it so so important for us in HE that I made the point twice. We didn't have any destination data after 6 months. And it's taken quite a while to work out what's happened to graduates. The indications are that the indications are very strongly that graduates fared better than most sections of certainly the new entrance to the labour market, but that was not the story that we got at the outset. So the big questions that I had to answer, and appreciate for many of you the fact that I'm talking about graduates may not seem wholly relevant, but the principles are important. So the three big questions that we were faced with is, how are things changing? How is the jobs market itself changing? How is the nature of graduate recruitment and work changing? And how, over time, this has become the really big question. And then, of course, how can this be conveyed in a way that can aid practice and information, advice and guidance? So I hit upon a relatively novel and extremely stupid solution, which was I decided to write a weekly newsletter, trying to synthesize all of this. If I'll be honest, I did it so that I could make sense of all the data. I was reading all of this stuff and trying to process it, and I happen to be the sort of person who, if I write things down and put them all somewhere, I can at least find them again later and understand it. And then I'd have thought, well, I'm doing all of this stuff for myself for the benefit of my user group. Why don't I just publish it? So I've been publishing weekly newsletters on the state of the labour market on JISC's Luminate site, which you can access. We recently had a break because I was a bit poorly, to be honest, but we're back to doing it. I was interrupted from writing this week's by this event. It should be ready to go onto the site tomorrow. So we are trying to track every week what is happening. And that's helped me think very carefully about the kind of data and information that I look at, how we convey it to people, and the sort of information that we get. So what do we use? So I use a mixture of four particular sources. Official sources. The Office of National Statistics have played an absolute blinder in this area, and I've worked really, really hard on producing really good quality labour market information as rapidly as they possibly can. We have sector bodies and employer groups, the Recruitment Employment Confederation, British Chambers of Commerce, the CIPD, have all been absolutely brilliant at this sort of thing. We've got over the last few months, and their data is often very, very useful. Although, again, it will come from a certain point of view. Commercial organisations indeed have been best at this, in my view, but other organisations, McKinsey, PwC, the banks in general, have done excellent jobs. And then third-party organisations, and the 5 organisations I put 4 down there. Actually, there's 6. I've come to think of it: Resolution Foundation, Centre for Cities, Sutton Trust, Institute of Employment Studies, Emma's group, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and the Learning and Work Institute have been particularly good. And for UK-wide information. One of the difficulties of getting rapid information is that because it's quite broad and undifferentiated, it's quite hard to get local information. There are a few local organisations who've tried very hard to produce local level information. The Fraser of Allender Institute, for example, in Scotland, and there are a couple of organisations in Northern Ireland who've tried really hard to get good information. The Senedd in Wales has also tried really hard, but on a more local level, it's often a little more difficult. But those are the main information sources that I use. So let's take a look in the time available at those information sources and the pros and cons. So the official data, which is mostly the Office of National Statistics, but there are also some other sources: Department for Education, Bank of England, government departments in general. They're updated regularly and frequently. They tell you in advance when things are going to come out, and they come out on a schedule, so you can plan your newsletters, your bulletins, your updates, so forth, around their schedules. We know well in advance when the Office of National Statistics is going to do a monthly labour market summary. We know well in advance when they're going to do their, every Thursday they do a weekly bulletin on changes in the labour market and business. It's quite broad, but not a lot of detail due to rapidity. But the data is often open source and available, so you can dig through it if you want to find any information that's relevant to particular sectors, to particular parts of the country, and particular vacancy data. Because of its simplicity as well, it's not always, it's often easier, or it's a little bit more proof against misinterpretation, in my experience. They tend to be quite broad, undifferentiated, about the same things week in, week out, nice and regular, nice and frequent, and they make a good backbone and a good basis for any kind of regular insight or update. Sector and employer groups have a relatively regular update cycle. There are some special reports, but for example, Recruitment and Employment Confederation do their report for jobs every month and a jobs outlook every month on a 2-week cycle. So every fortnight, the Recruitment and Employment Confederation are going to have a really good look, really good, useful, in-depth look from the recruitment agencies about what's going on in the sector. But they can be quite narrowly focused. They rarely have graduates or indeed new entrants to the jobs market specifically forefronted. The other issue is that the reports are usually available. The data is often not available, although many of these organisations, if you ask them very nicely, they will let you get hold of bits and bobs. So, and because they have their interests and their group focuses, they will now generally tend to have a slant. It is not necessarily, that's not necessarily a problem. Everybody has a slant on their reports. It can just be frustrating if they've got data on a thing that you're interested in, but that's not the bit that they're interested, they themselves are interested in this month. So they're pretty good. They're they're professionally done. They're to good quality standards because, often for many of these organizations, good quality data is part of their membership proposition. So they need to get this stuff right. So those are another important source of information. Commercial organisations, this is a slightly different proposition. They're not usually on a regular update cycle. They've usually been commissioned. They're often very broad, but also cover a wide range of commercially focused topics. A future of work, international insights, particularly good on they're particularly good place to look for things on things like future of work and virtual and hybrid working and this kind of thing. It's not always easy to get at the full reports and certainly not the data, indeed, again, the exception. I also must point out that often the analysts involved are very, very good here as well. They can be quite open, but because some of these organisations and the reports are commercially oriented, sometimes you have to be quite creative in trying to get hold of the information. So they are useful as kind of the seasoning on top of the basics of your dish. And then finally, the third-party organisations. They're not on a regular update cycle. They're usually very focused, often on areas of charitable and campaigning interest. They often overlap. There's been a lot of interest on workers with disadvantage, for example, issues facing young workers, and so on. The full reports are usually available. I will also say, actually, the fourth point is, in general, and this is not a slight on anybody else, in general, the very best researchers are from these organisations, in my experience. So the absolute cream of the reports, when they are produced, tends to be from this kind of organisation. These are the top draw pros who are focused on these areas as out for a living. The commercial organisations have excellent analysts, but they tend to have a wide range of interests. The government organisations obviously have really, really good analysts, but their job is in producing data and not always in making it as easy as possible to use. But people like Emma and Wendy and other organisations in this area are both absolutely first-rate researchers, but also excellent communicators. So these are reports that I have a tendency to produce to have the longest shelf life and that have the most useful information in them. Again, because of the nature of the organisations involved, there's often an angle. They often have their own interests, and sometimes you need to interpret those data through those lenses, but they are often very useful in that respect. So what's it like working in this information environment? Well, it's a bit like that, to be honest. I'm constantly deluged with information. It's a bit like trying to drink water directly from the hose, but it's also important that somebody does that so that the rest of you only get splashed rather than drenched. Let's say I've tried to go through this quite quickly. So in conclusion, COVID, like all the developments that come on, has rapidly disrupted the information environment. We do have a lot more, much more rapid, up-to-date labour market information, but it tends to be broad, not deep. There are many organisations offering insight, but very few who are actually synthesising it on a group level, on a bulk level. And because of social media, it's often very, very easy for people to get very odd views, very inaccurate views about what's going on out there, unfortunately. Social media is a great tool for disseminating information, but we must also acknowledge that it can also essentially be a competitor in terms of good versus bad information. And for those of us involved in dissemination and using this data, it's really important to make sure that we challenge bad information when we see it, and to make sure that good information doesn't get out competed by bad. I'm going to leave it there, and I'm actually going to, if that's okay, Rosemary, I'm just going to see if there are questions in the chat that I can answer.
Well, there was a great question just there about whether there's any friendly LMI suitable for students who will graduate from university BA in 4 years' time.
Yes,
that's looking ahead a little bit.
I would honestly advise you, and this seems self-serving, but if you go to, and I'll put it in the chat, if you go to our website, Prospects Illuminate, that's what we're supposed to be doing. And if we're not doing it, let us know so we can be better at it. So I'm going to put that in the chat. So the website on which I publish most of my stuff is designed, at least in theory, for that purpose. And if it's not doing that job, it'd be really useful if I know about it so that we can improve. I seem to have lost the opportunity or the ability to open chat up, because I think
perhaps if you stop sharing, Charlie, that might.
That's a good idea. Why don't I do that?
I tell you what I was struck by. It sounds like if people start following you on Twitter and tap into your weekly digest, then that's half the problem.
Shall I be honest and say,
solution,
actually,
rather?
I don't use Twitter as much as I used to. Follow me on LinkedIn.
LinkedIn.
Twitter is Twitter's not the ideal place to interact with people who have questions.
No.
So I use LinkedIn a little bit more. But follow me on LinkedIn, and you should get you will get most of the things that I do on I do if you go follow me on Twitter, and I do use that a reasonable amount, but I'm more on LinkedIn.
Okay, just a time check. I've had a look through the chat, and there's some really good things that have come up in the chat. And I think what we will do now is have our break, and then we'll hear from Keith after the break, and then we've got our session at the end where we can really tackle some of the the themes that are emerging, some of the questions that are emerging in a sort of plenary. So that's what I would like to suggest we do now. I think people probably are ready for a little bit of a break to get a coffee or whatever. So if we can come back at 3:15, and thanks very much, Charlie. That was a really great session, and to Wendy and Emma for the great contributions as well earlier. There's a lot to take in, so people have had a bit of time now to probably reflect and keep your questions coming. And then whilst you're having your break, we can be looking in the chat and picking up any things where we can share more information. As Wendy says, we'll do a sort of a digest of everything as well. So if everyone wants to head off for a break now and come back at 3:15, we'll look forward to seeing you there.
If anybody has any questions for me, I'll hang around, by the way. You can use the IES website and the Learning and Work Institute newsletters, but I nick all the stuff out of there and stick them in my updates anyway. So
sounds like you're doing all the hard work, Charlie.
that's my job too. I hope I am. I am making things easier for everybody on this call by meaning they don't have to go to so many sources. I'm not trying to drive traffic away from Emma in particular, because everybody should read everything Emma ever writes. But it will be useful if I'm cutting out some of the middle person. Louise, have you got a question for me?
I certainly have. Thank you very much, Charlie. So I'm a enterprise coordinator for the CEC down in the Kent Medway Hub, And I appreciate you've got a
Yes.
few other ECs on the list, as I've noticed as we've gone through. And I think sort of the vast majority of our certified coordinators work with secondary schools. And obviously what you've talked about is sort of very graduate information. I think the problem a lot of our careers leaders are having is actually making that information understandable, interesting, and well delivered for that sort of secondary cohort. Have you got any ideas of what can give to them?
I do agree, Louise, and it's an issue. Obviously, I am paid to talk specifically to college and university students and graduates, and so it's not what I'm theoretically supposed to be doing. I'm not theoretically supposed to be talking to that majority of your students who fall into who aren't going to go on to further post-18 education. That said, I do think there's a lot of information in there in the things that I do that are valuable, because if I'll be honest, I try to sneak as much in as I can under cover of the graduate labelling. I am very open to any suggestions from my colleagues in schools on how I can, and the sort of things that your students are interested in, and the sort of ways that I can make it more palatable to them. It's important to stress that I'm not in the business of trying to convince people to go to university. That's not at all what I'm interested in doing. So people who, if people are concerned, if you read my stuff, I'm going to try and convince them to go to university when it's not appropriate. No, absolutely not.
I mean, that graduate information presumably is quite relevant for those coming out of perhaps or in the middle of degree apprenticeships and things like that, because that is still sort of relevant to what to move on to. Absolutely, apprenticeship.
And I'm trying to be careful. And obviously, the hot topic one of the hot topics at the moment is the future of work, which is relevant to everybody. What is work? What is work going to be like? Is hybrid working here to stay? And spoiler, yes. How is that going to affect our future workforce profoundly, and not just in terms of the way that they work, but in terms of the way that they're recruited, the way that they progress, the way that they're trained.
We've seen that change a lot already, haven't we?
Yeah, absolutely. But the other thing to bear in mind is that actually they're absorbing a lot of it already. I mean, we get a lot of questions, and we even had it in the brief breakout we had just after the last session about what's AI going to do to the workforce? Well, as far as I can tell, and from the work that I've done, it's going to do the same sort of things that the internet did. And for those of us who were working during the kind of onset of the internet, which let's not forget, 25 years ago, the internet was not, well, 30 years ago, actually, probably better to stay now. 30 years ago, the internet was very far from ubiquitous, and was actually still a bit niche at work. So we're talking half a working lifetime ago. Somehow society just about navigated it, although I'm not convinced about some of our social and democratic institutions, but by and large, the world of work navigated it. And I think the same will be for AI. The reason why AI has caused a lot more stir is simply because we can see it coming, whereas we didn't spot the internet coming.
I would say that people are much better placed, to be honest, to take on AI after what's happened over the last few years.
That's absolutely right. And there was a really good report that came out at the end of last year from PwC, actually, for the Department of Education, about the likely impact of AI in the UK economy, and they think it's going to be about jobs neutral. And part of that is because of Morovich's paradox, which is that actually some of the things that we find very easy, because we've evolved over millions of years to be able to do them, like, walking about and noticing things and that kind of stuff, and communicating with each other, are actually really, really hard for AI. But some of the things that we have to be trained to do, like, unfortunately for me, data pattern recognition, are very easy to do for AI. So actually, a lot of the impact of AI will not necessarily be where people think it's going to be. It's actually on some of the things that we think comes naturally to people, but in fact, the results of millions and millions of years of specialist evolution to be able to do them.
No, I'll be interested to see that coming through. It's got to be said, and actually how that's going to impact, what our students are learning now. And this is one thing I keep trying to get across to our careers leaders. Don't necessarily focus on where the jobs are now. It's actually, especially when you're talking to year 7, year 8, year 9, so you've got to think about what's going to be happening in 4, 5, 10 years time, and what jobs are going to be available. That's
absolutely right, and that is a very, very tricky job. An important part of what I do, an important part of what people in my position do, is the most important phrase in our armoury, which isn't used often enough, and that is, I don't know. Because there are things we don't know what's going to happen. We can take we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen. We can make a decent stab at it, but it's important for all of us in the kind of position that I'm in, to daily ingest a big heaping dose of humility. We're always going to get things wrong. Well, we learn more from getting things wrong than we do from getting things right. So it's important. One of the things I do every year is I do a prediction for the coming year every year, but I also do a look back at last year's prediction, and particularly focusing on all the stuff I got wrong. And that's always really, really useful, because I don't look at just what I got wrong, but why it was wrong, which is really, and it's usually comes from I applied, learning from a different situation to the wrong context, and it's really, really interesting to do that. Sorry, Louise, I've got another question, so I'm gonna let you go.
Yeah, no, hopefully, I was going to say thank you ever so much for your time.
And let me know if there's anything that we're doing that can help you. And how we can make
brilliant.
I've
connected with you on LinkedIn, so hopefully we'll sort of keep in contact on there. Thanks ever so much for your time, Charlie.
Mark, what can I do for you?
Hi. Yep. Yeah, you can hear me now. You can't see me.
I can hear you now, Mark.
First thing, I've just sent you a request on LinkedIn, so you can accept that. That'd be great. I work both in the UK, but we work in a lot of boarding schools. We also work internationally as well. A lot of the British international schools overseas. And a lot of the questions over the last few years have changed from the quality of the education in HE to, is that going to get me a job back in my home country? We're struggling to find lots of information about international students back home, e.g. My Malaysian student, well, if they come and study in the UK, where are their destinations back in Malaysia? Do they stay in the UK to study, to work? We're not, we know the agency sort of looking into that a little bit more, but we're struggling.
The honest answer, Mark, is it's very, very, very hard to do.
Yeah.
Because in order, so to pick a very obvious example is, we would need to find somebody who is an expert on the Malaysian labour market. And to my knowledge, there are very few in the UK. And to be able to pass that in terms that they have greater expertise in the Malaysian labour market than Malaysian nationals themselves, number one. Secondly, can explain it in terms that are relevant. The honest answer is, Mark, we haven't cracked that problem. We haven't cracked that problem for any country in the UK, in the world. We put quite a lot of resources a few years back into trying to do it specifically for Hong Kong, a fairly small labour market. To give you an idea of how long ago
Hong Kong schools,
still independent. And we spent, and this was back when Prospects was not part of JISC. We spent 6 months pretty solidly trying to do it, and we did okay, actually. We did a really good job, but it was just resource wise, it was unsustainable. It was not doable. So we have to think of a pragmatic but sensible way of being able to offer your overseas students the level of information that they deserve. And if I'll be honest, I don't think we can do that just yet. And it bothers me. It pains me to be able to say that, because I get this question quite a bit. And unfortunately, this is the answer I have to give, which is not satisfactory for me. But I think it's important to be honest. We can't do it just yet. And yeah, it's not a straightforward issue. We have enough trouble trying to get insights into the UK. We don't know enough about the labour market in Cornwall or East Anglia or Northumberland or rural labour markets in general in the UK, for example. And and it's frustrating for me, and it's frustrating for you. But
yeah, it's going to be an interesting
you are
one.
presenting me with a very you're presenting me with a known but very difficult problem.
Yeah,
we are very well aware, and we are trying to do something with it. We're specifically trying to do something about it at GIST because we may have we may have enough resources to really make a stab at it, but it will take a while.
Yeah, and I mean,
sorry.
it's interesting because more and more parents. So I've worked internationally for 10+ years in international schools around the world, so working UK as well. And it was never the question. It was about the quality of the institute they were going to. Was always the questions parents would ask, because it didn't. Over the last 5 years or 2 or 3 years, it's been, what are their prospects of getting a job back here? And it's becoming a very much the factor in why they may choose to come to the UK to study over other places. Or it seems to be from, well, what do I know? From the kids and the parents I chat to.
A lot of the problem is, to be honest, Mark, is that actually the quality of local labour market information in other countries is generally not that great.
Yeah.
So, for example, I can do you a decent labour market, I can do that job for Australia, but I can do that job for Australia not just because they speak English, but also because there's decent labour market for Australia. There's decent labour market information for Italy, for example, because the Italians have to be pretty good at it, or for Finland. And all I need is either to use my rusty in Italian or to get a Finnish speaker to do that kind of thing. But for large second world nations like Malaysia, there isn't good labour market. So we basically have to do labour market information better, Malaysian labour market information better than the Malaysians to be able to do that job. That's not impossible, but it is a tough ask.
Right, perfect. Thanks for
Shirley,
that.
can I interrupt a little bit, because I don't know who's gone for a break and who hasn't. Obviously, some people took good advantage of engaging with you directly, which was super. So I'm assuming some people did go for a break, and I'm assuming everyone's back. Perhaps give us a thumbs up to say you're back, because we'd like to start the next input. And just thinking about this next input, I think it's a really interesting one, because I think you mentioned, Charlie, a couple of times about, interpretation of the data, or, having a particular viewpoint on the data. And when you read something that's a sort of aspect of it. And that's the very topic that Keith is going to talk about now, Keith Herman. And I think this is a really interesting angle on the politics of labour market information and the bias and the way, I guess governments put a spin on it, employers put a spin on it as well. Institutions put a spin on it, schools put a spin on it. So Keith, it would be great for you to take us through your session on this topic, and then, as we say, the latter part of the day, we've got some time to have more questions, more discussion and breakouts. So Keith, welcome.
Super, thank you, Rosemary. I'm just waiting for slides to hopefully load, and hopefully you can see them.
Yep, can see them.
And we just go into full screen mode. This is where things get slightly challenging, because I work off 3 screens. So I'm never quite sure what people are saying. So let's try this. What can you see on your side?
Perfect.
You can see one slide with a.
You're in slideshow, yeah.
Right, in full slideshow. That's super. Okay, good. Right. Right. Okay. Super. I'm going to come back into this so people can vaguely see who I am. I'll try and find the mouse on my screen, which has disappeared. Right, so I'll start with, my name is Keith Herman. I'm Director of Higher Ed Research. Unlike all the excellent panel members today, I'm no expert in labour market intel and insight and whatever, but today I'm presenting what I would describe as a polemic, a challenge with regards to labour market data, and consider some of the politics, I guess, of the labour market and LMI, with a view to presenting to the group, I guess, a theoretical hypothesis with regards to how we understand labour market data, what it means, and the challenges that we face. Right, let's go here. In terms of my broader background, I was previously Director of Employability and at the University of Surrey. I've also worked in the higher education policy space. And as you will see today, the sort of hypothesis that I put up for discussion, which is essentially about what I perceive to be a sort of fairly stark way of understanding the labour market in broad terms, the STEM economy versus the creative economy. I want to start off today by putting this up as a topic for discussion in terms of how we understand the labour market and what that means for young people going forward in terms of their futures. And I'm going to start with a quote from a report done by Rosie Alexander, Graham McCabe, and Mark DeBacker. And on the right-hand side, you should see there a quote which says, using the terminology of LMI clearly locates the work of careers advisors and its services in terms of national economic and educational policy interests. However, to just use the language of LMI risks underplaying the much wider information needs of individuals and career services, including critically the importance of occupational and educational information. So, the very good report is suggesting that, yes, it's all very well having all this abundance of data, but what does it mean and how do we ensure that we, in particular, help young people, as well as adults for that matter, to understand the labour market and make decisions with regards to it? And on this slide, you can see on the right-hand side, the cover page for Rosie's excellent report, and she did a presentation for NICEC a little while back as well, and really sort of teased out and explored, to some extent, like Charlie's done today, the various sources of LMI data, and they also looked internationally as well. On the left-hand side, you can see a report by the UK Commission for Employment and Skills, which was some research done in 2014, in fact, looking to the future world of work and jobs in 2030, and also looking at the skills needed in the workplace and what that means and what changes may happen by 2030. And again, that sort of frames LMI data in a much broader, wider context of seeing it over time, not just in terms of understanding the labour market as we know, see and understand it today. To give you some sense of what's happening in this space and how people are understanding labour markets and the broader political and social and the broader economy and industry, I want to just quote to you very briefly from a report by the Committee of Public Accounts in the House of Commons, with a report titled Delivering STEM Skills for the Economy. It's a 2018-2019 report, so it's slightly dated in terms of pre-pandemic, but certainly the summary headline is quite interesting in terms of what it's suggesting. And it starts, STEM skills are crucial for the UK's productivity, and a shortage of STEM skills in the workforce is one of our key economic problems. The future workforce relies on many more children and young people being encouraged to take STEM subjects and enter STEM careers. Government is not well placed to understand the extent of the challenge and ensure the supply of STEM skills, especially in the context of the withdrawal from the European Union. In particular, there remains a need to address marked gender imbalances in several areas of STEM learning and work, demonstrated, for example, by the fact that only 8% of STEM apprenticeship starts are undertaken by women. And then there's this delightful reference to, which I totally disagree with. In the report, it says, the quality of careers advice in schools is patchy at best, perpetuating misconceptions about STEM careers. If only they knew how to resource career education, career guidance in schools, but that's another topic altogether. In addition, the way that schools are funded will restrict the likelihood of pupils moving to other more STEM-focused learning providers, such as the new Institute of Technology. To make better informed decisions, departments also need to tackle the apparent lack of industry and commercial experience on their STEM boards and working groups. So there's an interesting report which is very much about putting to the fore the role and the importance of STEM education and STEM skills and the STEM industry sectors for future jobs. By contrast, we have, and I can just show you very briefly, what STEM skills and jobs look like. Someone has visualized that, and you can see on screen, I hope, a whole series of collections of images that whereby one can understand and visualize what we mean by science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And curiously, of course, we know STEM jobs and people studying STEM subjects will say it's not just about the maths or the science or the engineering. It's a much broader picture than that. But because, and my argument would be, because there's this overemphasis on STEM and the STEM industries, no surprise, a lot of career education support around STEM has been massively invested in. Here, for example, on screen, you can see some work that's been done around helping young people understand and how we go about presenting STEM occupations, in this case, a geologist. And again, the use of creative images, the use of interesting and very different types of language to understand what a geologist is, what they do, where they work, how they go about their work, what it means for them, what kinds of attributes they would need to have. So on screen, you can see, for example, there it speaks about, these kinds of people being observant, curious, and creative. Perhaps some people may look at a geologist and not even link it to the word creativity. Then by contrast, if I look at the broader creative and cultural industries, we know from research and advocacy work done by a range of organizations that's equally important. So we need to raise young people's awareness and build aspiration around understanding the creative and cultural industries. So to give an insight into understanding that broad range of industry sectors, here is some data about the UK creative industries and its worth and value to the UK economy. And to quote from the government's press release around the creative industries, who would have thought that the creative industries contribute almost £13 million to the UK economy every hour. Right? It's worth something like £115.9 billion to our economy and spans a wide range of industries. Advertising and marketing, for example, were the two key drivers of growth in the creative industries. But we also know that in terms of the creative industries and their contribution to the economy, there are also other industry sectors which are really, really important. For example, the sector was supported by large contributions from the tech services and the film and television industries, which contributed some 45.4 billion and 20.8 billion pounds to the economy, respectively. Another boost by advertising and marketing industries, which account for a quarter of the total growth of the creative industry since 2017. And of course, a lot of people, again, from a geographic point of view, think that the creative industries is all about London. Here again on screen, you will see the creative industry in terms of jobs and by location. Of course, the Southeast is incredibly important, but this industry is located across the country, up and down the country. And so what we in essence have in terms of how labor market information, how data, how research, how industry groups and lobby groups work in the political space, we seemingly have this what appears to be an artificial divide, of which some people perceive that it's the geeks and the STEM and the innovation-focused industries that are ruling the roost, so to speak, with regards to their role and contribution to the economy. But we know, here on screen, you will see an article about the hipsters versus the geeks, creative workers, STEM and innovation in US cities, which highlights that it's both people working in STEM industries and people working in creative and cultural and arts industries that together contribute to innovation, in this case in US cities. It's not a binary divide, either STEM or arts, creative and cultural sectors.
Keith, sorry to interrupt, but your slides have gone back onto outline view, and a few people, I don't know quite happened. Sorry, so just because it's easier for people to see the full slides. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much for that. How's it looking now?
Great, perfect, thanks.
Super. All right, thank you. My computer does funny things in PowerPoint. And then at the bottom of the screen, what you see there is a clipping from an article out of The Guardian from 2009. So this discussion and debate about what are the most important contributing industry sectors to the economy, where should we be focusing our efforts in terms of investment, as well as building aspiration, nurturing talent, is very much a long-standing debate, a long-running one. And this from Professor Elaine Thomas, who was previously the Vice Chancellor of the University for the Creative Arts, who way back then was arguing that we must invest in creativity, not just STEM subjects. And this supposed bias, the way in which we understand our labour markets, has a direct impact on what's happening in our secondary schools. So let me quote you some data around the challenges with regards to this. In 2017, entries for GCSEs in creative subjects fell by 47,000. entry to GCSE design and technology fell by 18,800, and this accounts for 40% of the overall drop. The current entry rates, again, quoted in 2017 to creative subjects at Key Stage 4, have fallen to the lowest level in a decade. No doubt that those trends may well have continued. And therefore, many organizations like Nestor and the Creative Industries Federation, amongst many others, have made some very strong arguments about how do we better equip young people to understand their subject choices in school and better help them understand the industries that they wish to go into, or be more aware of the industries that they have opportunity to go into, by presenting the information to them, not just in the form of data and salary and what industries are supposedly growing, but can we develop a more nuanced, a richer, deeper picture of understanding the labor market and the economy going forward. Again, just to give you some sense of contrast, this is again a presentation of a report based on some projections about occupations by 2024. And again, you can see in terms of the creative industries and creative occupations, by contrast with STEM occupations, these are not out of proportion in terms of their size, scope, and contribution to the economy. But somehow we seem to have, particularly with the policymakers, got into a way of thinking about the UK economy, which is essentially, it's all about science, technology, innovation, high-tech jobs, whereas by contrast, there are lots of opportunities and a significant contribution to the UK economy by the broader creative industries. On screen, you can also see some examples of STEM occupations. And usefully in the slide, it also shows where an overlap, where both STEM skills and creativity are combined together to offer opportunities for jobs that exist today and will do so in the future around web design and development, programming and software development, IT business analysts, architects, assistant designers, and information technology and telecommunications directors, and so on. So again, the way we understand the economy, it's far more nuanced than is often presented in the media. Now, I want to move on to now, just cover a broad topic, and what you see on screen is, in fact, Charlie, that's your report. I cover from it about busting graduate job myths. And I want to focus specifically on one element of that. I'm sure Charlie can speak to the details of the report itself in greater detail later on. But I want to just give you a sense of our understanding with regards to the geography of opportunity and the geography of jobs and occupations. And this has, of course, particular bearing importance with regards to the conversation that we're having at the moment about leveling up our society, our economy, and leveling up opportunity as well. And here there are two topics for discussion. One is recognizing that a lot of people perceive there is a myth that all the jobs are in London, and this report that Charlie's done for Universities UK specifies very clearly that there is significant and enormous opportunity beyond the M25. We need to break down these myths of where graduates end up working. In this case, the focus is on university graduates, and the research shows that particularly in regions beyond London, a lot of graduates either stay in their regions, and or these regions are quite attractive to graduates to come live, work, and study. And so we need to think about how we go about breaking down these myths that perpetuate people thinking around all the jobs are in London. The second dimension, which is something that I don't have time to discuss today, but is a really important part of the discussion around the labour market, is that it's not just all about graduate jobs. There are a wide range of pathways and opportunities for young people into further education, into technical and vocational education, and beyond that into a wide range of exciting job opportunities. And there is a challenge that we all have to widen, broaden, deepen, and be far more creative about how we help young people make informed choices about subjects, about pathways into higher and further education, and about pathways into jobs beyond study, even and particularly through the apprenticeship route, which, in my opinion, at this point in time, is still massively underplayed in terms of opportunities for young people going forward. So there's a big opportunity, but also a big challenge for us about how we understand and present the labour market, particularly in terms of how we help young people make informed choices, especially around the technical vocational options that they have alongside opportunities to go to university. And then finally, let me close out here with a little bit of a nostalgic piece. This on screen you can see here is a little flyer, and in fact I have it here with me, from 2007, from something called Connections. Some of us may remember that, and I just want to close out with a quote from this short 15 page note with regards to the importance of careers education and helping young people make informed choices about their careers and jobs and further study options. And here it says, careers education and work-related learning are essential to preparing young people for adult life, helping them to see the relevance of education to their future lives and developing their employability. Many of the skills valued in both higher education and future employment can be developed through career planning and work-related activities. Improved knowledge of the labor market and employers' needs will help young people to make informed decisions about choices in learning and work. So speaking to the audience out there today, I know you're all very actively involved in supporting young people and I'm sure adults in the workplace as well around making informed choices with regards to the jobs that they're in, the jobs that they want in the future, and where the opportunities lie. My final remarks is with regards to this polemic, this way of presenting the labor market information and opportunity to young people and to adults in the workplace. We need to be far more creative and far more balanced in how we present the information so that we can help young people and adults make the choices that are right for them. Super, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Keith. I found that really fascinating. Keith, would you like to take some questions if anyone wants to raise a hand and comment or yeah, ask a question?
Happy to take questions, yeah.
I mean, what I thought was very compelling was just using the data around the differences between the creative industries and STEM industries, that in itself data, isn't it? That's powerful. Yeah. So thanks for that, Keith. I can see we've got a raised hand from C. White. Sorry, I don't know your name.
It's Colin. My name's
Colin. Hi, Colin.
Hi there. Yeah, I was just I was very interested actually, because one of the things I was thinking myself is that there's a lot of there was a big issue about where the funding is going for things like T levels and these, which is actually potentially narrowing choice, whereas there are all these other sort of vocational courses like BTECs and various other types of courses, but with the T levels, and also there's discussion on level 2 qualifications and how they're going to feed into T levels. I was just wondering if you've got a bit of an idea around that, because I think that's one of the big issues, because that's where we're being directed by how the young people are being taught, really.
Certainly, I'm not an expert on T levels, but certainly my observation of the education system, particularly at secondary level, is that there has been a narrowing of choice in terms of subject, with a strong bias and skew, if I can put it that way, towards STEM type subjects and maths, and in particular, and a de-emphasizing of the broad range of creative subjects that are available to young people. And you can see that very much coming to the fore with regards to T levels, where again there seems to be a much stronger emphasis on STEM related subjects, and this in a way just reinforces to some extent, I think, the bias that we have built into the policymaking system, that there is this orientation around that the future of our economies is solely relying essentially on STEM industries, and of course financial services is quite significant as well, but even financial services relies quite fundamentally on STEM skills to a large degree, and again this bias, I think, resides there, to some extent driven by the data, but I think to a large extent driven by the policymakers thinking around what we value. And that's where we have the challenge to shift the narrative. As you will have seen on the screen, I showed those infographics that illustrate the importance of the creative industries to the UK economy. We need to just be far more balanced in how we present that information, and perhaps be more dynamic and active in our activism, in our thinking about and our presentation of the information around the opportunities in creative industries, and be more active in our lobbying and advocacy work, particularly with the Department for Education, around taking a far more balanced view of the value of subject in secondary education and, of course, in our college and higher education system.
Yeah, I mean, I was very interested to see that there's a lot of industries where STEM and creative are combined. So,
yeah.
You know, so it's important to keep those going. I mean, media is a big thing, you know, technical media production and things, and the UK is one of the leaders of that in industry. That's why they, you know, we film so many things in the UK. Yeah, so I think it's important to keep it in perspective, I suppose, isn't it?
Yep, no, I certainly would agree with that. You know, there are quite significant industries across creative, cultural, arts industries, sectors that do have a significant impact on the UK economy, and we just need to highlight those more effectively and give examples, particularly to young people, to enable them to understand what opportunities there are. If I think, for example, of animation and the exciting jobs that are coming on stream around the metaverse, whatever that thing is, right? Again, those jobs are not just IT coding, you know, programming type jobs. There are all sorts of opportunities around leveraging skills predicated on creativity that are equally important for those kinds of jobs. So the narrowing of measures that we have around data and around understanding the contribution of industries is doing us a great disservice.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith. I just noticed some question in the chat about the slides. The slides, I believe, will be uploaded onto the CDI website at some point. We will be collating them all, so you will be able to track them later. Any other questions for Keith, though, while we sort of move into our final session? I was just thinking, Keith, about, you know, talking about creative industries, the current targeting, this is getting into politics now, there isn't it? The current targeting of Channel 4 and the BBC from the government, you know, is also sending out signals, isn't it, about the commercialization or not of our creative industries. So that, I mean, there's that aspect of it as well, isn't there, going on at the moment? Okay, so yeah.
So there are certainly big challenges in this space, you know, in the political sense with the capital P as well as with a small p, and those send incredibly powerful signals into the marketplace, into our societies, and what that means and how we understand and interpret that in terms of where opportunity lies now as well as in the future. And you know, the classic stereotype, if I can put it this way, is if you go and do a search on the internet for Mickey Mouse degrees, right? There's a lot of narrative there which is wholly misinformed around, particularly around media studies and a wide range of subjects relating to the creative and arts and cultural industries that send a very, very misleading message around these industries and what they mean, both in terms of the student experience as well as in terms of the opportunity for young people and adults in these industries. And that is massively unhelpful in my view.
Indeed, agree. I think Wendy had her hand up and then Emma. So anyone else put their hand up as well? So Wendy, you wanted to come in.
Yes, fascinating debate there from Keith. I'm always deeply suspicious of anyone who's pushing one line. You know, I think one of the caveat emptor things we need is, you know, if people say it's only STEM or it's only creative or it's only tech or it's anything else, my little labour market antennae start vibrating very fast. And also, just to follow up on the vocational thing, again, I think we do the same. We've had a lot of pro-vocational, pro-apprenticeship political dialectic for a number of years. And again, I think different people are different. Vocational courses can open doors for people who know what they want to do, and they can close doors for people who don't know what they want to do. And I think, you know, the job of us all here is to recognise the range of work there is, but also the range of people and what they're interested in. So I just don't like these one-horse arguments, however they run, because it just tells me that someone is shoving people in the direction of something, when in fact our economy is quite diverse. And heaven knows people are very diverse. And I just think that's a sort of warning to us all, really. So thanks, Keith. I thought it was a very interesting portrayal.
Indeed. And actually building that, Wendy, you know, with hybrid working and virtual working, I do wonder if we're not pushing the boundaries enough globally, because in theory, you could be working for an organization from your home in the middle of Scotland and working for a global organization. So it isn't just about local information always either. So
no, and I'm just right now working with a big charity in its Asian countries, where they've just covered a maternity leave in Nepal by one of their staff working in West Africa. A finance manager,
and I'm sure that will happen more and more.
So I think it will be interesting in the particularly over the next year or two to see how that pans out, because remember, we've also got a government telling civil servants to get back into their offices, you know. So the power crazed will go on, won't they? That feeling, it's a bloke thing, I think, wanting people at their desks. But I think we don't, that's one of those areas where, as Charlie said, you know, we look to the future and we don't always know what's coming. But I think tracking what's happening is always very important. That's a better indication than someone's prediction of what we'll have 3 years down the road, which is always only someone's guess. But I think knowing what's happening right now is always interesting.
Thanks, Wendy. Emma, you wanted to come in. There's some great comments coming in the chat as well. If you're keeping an eye on the chat, everyone, there's some good points coming in there.
Rosemary. Yeah, thanks, Keith. I think it's such a really interesting discussion and a really interesting point around the STEM and the creativity and the kind of the way it's created, positioned as a dichotomy, two different things. And what I always find interesting when it comes back to my thinking around categories and definitions, because I think we segue between, often when talking about creativity or creatives, between sectors and jobs and skills, and they're all slightly different but overlapping things. And I think sometimes people use sector data to argue about creative jobs or creative skills to argue about creative sectors, and I think that sort of that interplay is perhaps not often teased out enough. I think because I think creativity and creative skills are argued to be the drivers of innovation, and they can be used in a whole range of different industries and jobs. And I think the argument around keeping creativity in education and creative subjects in education helps to support that argument, that it develops creative skills that can be used in a wide range of different industries and jobs, not just the creative industries, which have such an important part of the UK economy as well. So it's that interplay that I find really interesting, fascinating.
Oh yes, I certainly would agree with that, Emma, in terms of these are most definitely, this is definitely not an either or argument. It's very much a both argument in terms of the types of skills and capabilities that are needed across all sorts of industries, as well as how knowledge and expertise can be leveraged. For example, how creativity can be leveraged in engineering and science, and in film and in digital media and in a wide range of industry sectors. I mean, I think in terms of where we are now at immediately post-pandemic, for me, the big question mark is going to be, through the pandemic we've had, and this is just my percent, I guess, we've had this hyper presentation of science, you know, in terms of how we've asked scientists to be present and engage in the debate around COVID and how they've been actively involved in obviously exploring the vaccines and developing the vaccines and the rollout of the vaccines, and folks working across all parts of the NHS, in the health sectors as well, for example, very much coming to the fore in terms of people's understanding of what was happening during COVID. I'm really curious to see what impact that may well have on a wide range of young people in terms of their thinking and awareness of science and the NHS and jobs and opportunity in those sectors. And will it have an impact in terms of orientating their thinking going forward? It's just a left of field thought and comment and observation from my part.
Thanks, Keith. And I think that's Michael making a great point there. Michael, did you want to speak to that in the chat? I'm just picking up, which is a slightly different focus about what's going on inside organizations, people in the workplace. Michael, did you want to speak to that question?
Yes, sure. I was just pointing out that inside some larger organizations, a new idea of opportunity marketplaces is emerging, where people are able to share information about projects which people can then put themselves forward for as an adjunct, as a sideline to their main duties. And this allows people to perhaps gain a breadth of experience or do something which is outside of their professional training by perhaps joining in a creative project if they're an engineer, for example, on a short-term basis. And this is something we're seeing emerging in a lot of the larger corporates, certainly.
Yeah, I concur with that, Michael, and facilitating that as a means of people growing their skills, but also exploring opportunities that they maybe wouldn't have considered before. Any other questions for Keith? Because I've got a sort of a few thoughts of how we might round up our thinking and also open up more discussion, and we're going to go into another breakout. But any more points for Keith's session in particular from anyone?
Hello. Hi. I was just going to comment really that I think the thing with the creative courses and industries is that you have built into that already the idea that it's quite hard and you have to maybe sell yourself, and they build in business skills and all sorts of skills. And when you look at actual some labour market statistics show that maths graduates are more likely to be unemployed than drama graduates, because those arts graduates have already had built into their training, their development and everything, how to survive in whatever labour market they find themselves in. And perhaps the STEM subjects assume that people will be able to navigate the labour market very easily. And of course, there's a whole range of skills and attributes that people come out with. So, and perhaps it ought to be built into any subject area that you need to have skills to negotiate the labour market, and then you don't have to judge or pit one creative sector against the STEM sector.
I would agree with that, Nikki. And actually, we in my work, when I'm working in organisations, we often get asked by employers to help with people who get to the end of their professional training. So they could be engineers, they could be accountants, they could be lawyers, and they've been on this treadmill up to that point of professional qualification, narrow focus of what they want to do, and then they get qualified, and then the whole world opens up, and they have to make decisions about what type of law to go into. Do they want to become a manager? And they get really adrift at that point because they haven't been thinking in that strategic way about their careers up to that point. It's been on a very tunnel vision. So I see that quite a lot, which I think is speaking to what you were saying. Okay, super. Let's try and just I've been sort of reflecting on some of the themes that we've touched on today. So I'm going to try and just talk a little bit about that, and maybe then we can go into breakouts and you can have a chance yourselves to sort of reflect on your own takeaways from this and insights. So it seemed to me that we've been looking at labour market intelligence from a few lenses, and I picked this up from the chat as well. So there's the sort of big picture around where are things heading and having that sort of strategic view of trends, so that there is a narrative of sorts about what's happening, STEM, creative industries, the sort of slightly bigger picture of what we know, what's automation doing, how's that going to impact, and as Charlie said, we don't know, but you can sort of speculate about potential trends based on the information we have at this point. So there seems to me that's a big feature of what we need from labour market intelligence, because how do you talk to anyone about the future if you haven't got some narrative that to explore? So that's one thing I picked up. The other thing that a lot of people were mentioning in the chat, though, was about the importance of labour market information, not just to tell people where there's a demand, but for people to understand what they want and what choices they want to make, and how their qualifications are transferable to other things. And also there was a comment in the chat about building on your strengths. So actually, just if you focus on your strengths, that's the most important thing to do, and then you'll figure it out as you go along almost. And then there's a thing about where the hidden jobs. So it's almost like really helping people explore and understand for what's right for them. That was a theme I picked up. And then there was something about the sort of more immediate aspects of this, which are, you know, which sectors are hiring right now, what needs are there locally, where am I more likely to get a job right now if I'm looking. But that's fast changing, and there's the sort of tacit aspect that Wendy mentioned there as well. And then there's something that I think, because this audience is a lot of people working with young people, I think that's obviously in very much in many of your minds, is how do you get young people interested in and engage with labour market information, because they're more likely to listen to their friends or their parents who've got an outmoded view of what's actually going on in the workplace as well. And how do you get them, as we've just been talking about, to do their own research and equip themselves so that they're, you know, curious about this, and able to interpret that. And then there's also the impact of disruptive events. So those were the sort of themes that I've been sort of picking up on. Others may comment on that. So what I would suggest we do now is actually go back into breakouts, so you've got a chance to talk to each other. And I've got some questions. I'm just going to share my screen again, because I've got some questions that you might want to consider in breakouts. So let me just get the right slide up. And so just a suggestion, really, because we're trying to make sense of things here today, aren't we? We're trying to make sense of the insights from today as well. So the suggestion here is to go into breakout for 15 minutes and perhaps amongst yourselves, just think about the insights you're taking away from today, what's resonating with you, and what the implications of these insights have for your particular practice, wherever you're working. And then I think, just to stimulate a bit more discussion at the end, what questions or dilemmas are still remaining for you? You know, what are the conundrums that you're still trying to get your head around? And we can have a quite interesting discussion about that. Welcome back, everyone. I think everyone's starting to come back. I'm going to encourage people to put their cameras on, so we do know there are real people there behind the names. Yeah. So people still coming back, Ashley? Yeah. Just takes time, doesn't it, for gradually.
In about 10 seconds.
I hope you all managed to be in a group, because I think sometimes people get allocated, but they don't always appear, do they? So hopefully, I'm hoping you all had someone to talk to, at least one other person, and that you had a good discussion. So great. So what we thought we'd do now with the final 15-20 minutes or so is to take the chance now for you to, you know, if people are happy to contribute now to perhaps things that came out from your discussions, perhaps big topics that are still in your minds, what you're noticing from today's session, what's resonating with you. We had a vivid discussion in our group as well about this, so we can share as well. But would anyone like to contribute and get the discussion going? You know, what came out of your group? What insights were you taking away? What implications are you thinking about for your practice? And what questions or dilemmas are still remaining that would be good to air? So I think Andrew's got his hand up. Is that right, Andrew Holland? Oh no, I've got my cursor on you. That's why it looked like a hand. Anyone want to raise their hand and contribute something? Otherwise, I'll come to Wendy, who I know can always contribute something on this. Anyway, don't be shy. Come on, there must be one group that's willing to speak. Thank you. So that's Chris again, isn't it?
Colin, actually.
Colin, sorry.
All right. No, I think but one of the things that we were sort of coming was is how to use this in practice, really, because there are often, when you're talking to students, there's almost there are you know, it's such a broad and such a big thing to try and when people are trying to make decisions about what courses to do or whatever, to actually then sort of add in the you know, whether it's the trend for that career path is increasing or decreasing, or whether there's, you know, it's quite a complicated thing to try and sort of bring in, really. I think that's what one of the things. I mean, one of the things we were saying in our little group was that if you can find information that's like been neatly packaged so that you can sort of think, well, this is sort of like helping, this is sort of like increasing knowledge, where some analysis has already been done, because there's a lot of data and it appears very complicated, really, to actually look for, because there's so many sectors and so many, but you know, people have said about how there are, you know, there's, whether it's employers or sectors or career paths or whatever, it's quite a complicated thing then to increase and add into your practice, you know.
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, I think we sort of touched on that in our group as well. Panel, does any of you want to comment on that?
I just think in terms of it's a great observation and suggestion around packaging LMI in a more effective, consumable way. My only cautionary note on that would be, you know, yeah, we can do all the data analytics and the visualization of data, et cetera, with regards to LMI data. But the crucial thing for me is also putting that in the context of the broader industry trends that they are over the long term with regards to industry sectors and areas of opportunity, so that we don't think too narrowly about the job market and different industries. And so that we also, and so alongside just presenting information, this can't be passively consumed. There needs to be some form of active engagement by careers educators, by teachers, by careers advisors, alongside employers, to bring that data to life, if I can put it that way. You know, presenting data on what it means to become a robotics engineer is lovely, saying you earn £37,000 after 4 years, but without understanding how that sits within the context of opportunity and what it means to then become a robotics engineer, you know, 5 or 6 years after school, and the pathways towards that are equally part of the process as well. It's not just about data, in my view.
Thanks, Keith. Wendy, do you want to come in? Because what we were talking about, our group, was also other sources of information, which isn't just the sort of data. Wendy, do you want to say a bit about that?
Yes, I think Keith has probably opened that up for us. I think there's a real tension, isn't there? I think on the one hand, we do want kind of neatly packaged data, and as Charlie was saying, also intelligence in the sense that other people are giving us a commentary. And I think on the one hand, it really is worth signing up for those regular newsletters. And there are several I get regularly, and it only takes me 5 minutes to look at them, that just tell me like what is going on in very broad terms. But I think when it comes to, and several of your comments have asked this, when it comes to the more specific questions that someone has about a particular kind of work or a particular kind of course, that sort of data doesn't help us as much. And for me, I think a lot of it is about how you combine published information with people you can be put in contact with. And I'd be very interested to hear from the people here this afternoon about how on earth do you find the time to meet any employers? How many employers do young people get a chance to talk to? I've looked at some of the Gatsby research, for example, because talking to one employer might be quite a dangerous thing. Talking to 20 might be extremely enlightening. But also other people, parents, if you're dealing with school age. I know when I was a school governor responsible for careers work in our local school, we used an enormous diversity of parents to talk very informally about their work in all sorts of fields. So it's not really about numbers of jobs, it's about kinds of work, I think. But I know when you're busy and careers work may only be a part of what you do, thinking about how you most productively use your time. I think that's something today has really made me think about. And for me, it's those quick grabs of digested data, but then talking to people, always talking to people, not just trying to find the magic little package of numbers. And I'm a mathematician by background, so I love numbers, but it's made me very wary of numbers in this space. I just want to know if it's a huge number or a very little number. But, you know, whether it's gone up or down by 10 or 20 won't help people.
Yeah, just building what Helen's saying there in the chat, I was talking about this as well. Like when there'll be many of you here not working with young people, but working with adults, and a big tool, isn't it, is to get people to go off and do informational interviews with others who are doing different sorts of work, or if you're trying to move sideways, it's a really big tool for working with adults. So thanks for that, Helen. And I'm just conscious I've got a couple of hands raised. Louise, I think, was first, and then we'll have Mark.
Thank you, Rosemary. So I work for the Careers and Enterprise Company. I'm an enterprise coordinator down in Kent and Medway. I've actually got a colleague of mine on the line as well, who I'm sure will back me up if there's some of these things I might say. Wendy, I'd just like to pick up on the last point you said about careers leaders and the time that they have to actually be able to sort of go and find that information and be able to do that. And I think sort of some of the things that came out from the chats and some of the things that have been said is the fact that actually some neatly packaged LMI resources for careers leaders and indeed teachers that is very much related to the subjects they teach, so they can bring in that Gatsby benchmark 4 of actually building that into the curriculum. And actually, if you can get those conversations thinking about actually students not having to make this is what I'm going to do and this is where I'm going to do it and this is how I'm going to get there, but actually having that really wide understanding of actually how different jobs are different in different areas, i.e. if you want to go and be a car manufacturer, you're not going to go and do that in the southeast of England. And actually understanding some of that information, that can't all be given over in one LMI session, a 1 hour session that they might get once a year as they go through school, and is actually embedding some of that careers language and actually that understanding that teachers have of their own subjects and how that fits in and where those jobs are available. I think there's a real gap sort of somewhere where you've got Unifrog, you've got Growfile, you've got Start Profile, you've got all of these platforms that bring in LMI to their platforms, but actually it's not easily packaged I don't think they're easily packaged for students to actually understand what that means. It needs to be brought to life. I think there could be a website that is literally solely just about LMI, resources for teachers to be able to go and say, I'm delivering English today. I want a bit of Gatsby benchmark 4 and a bit of Gatsby benchmark 2 all thrown in together so I can deliver it in some kind of lesson so I can understand what I'm talking about and actually be able to deliver that all in one go. You don't even have to actually label it LMI, do you, from a student's point of view? They don't need to know it's handy for them to know it's labour market information, but actually this isn't, as soon as you mention LMI to students, they go, oh, and we all know that, we've all seen their faces as they go and do it. So actually, if it's just that careers language that's being spoken by a teacher, that will just fall into place in the long term and getting students to think about that right from primary school all the way through. But I do think there's a gap in there that somebody could create a website that's got everything about LMI, because for careers leaders, for teachers, for students, for parents, particularly parents, they don't understand labour market information. They're not supporting our young people thinking about actually being able to travel outside of their local area we've got very, very rural areas that students will not leave, but actually their availability of jobs there is next to nothing. But they've not been encouraged to move out of that. So actually, again, for parents to be able to encourage their young people to move out, I will get off my high horse and let Mark have a say in whatever question he has.
I think thanks for that, Louise, and that passion you've got behind the subject. And I think someone earlier on in the chat said, could the CDI have a hub for this, as a role? Perhaps. So that's something perhaps those of you who are here from the CDI could think about, perhaps, because that conduit, isn't it, as a resource that's helpful. Let's come to Mark.
Sorry, have you looked at the Warwick University Labour Market Information for All website?
I have heard of that one before.
That's one worth looking at. It's a sort of, I don't know if we've got anyone here today with specialist knowledge about it, but it's a sort of signposting site. It doesn't exactly package stuff. It helps you know where to go. but worth looking at that one, certainly.
Brilliant, thank you for that reminder, because actually, yes, I used to use that when I was up in London and not thought about it since I've sort of moved to Kent. So thank you. I will have another look at that.
Mark, I think you had your hand raised.
Yeah, so there's exactly the same theme, to be honest, and sort of picked up from our discussion really that I did spot at one point there was about 140 people on the session, and if all 140 of us all go off to put our own presentations together, it seems a little bit of a waste of resource, really. It sounds like it sounds like the Careers Enterprise Company might have just have offered to do it all for us, though, by what Louise was just saying, so we might not need to bother. But that was sort of the general gist. It was making it exciting for young people, how we put it together, because the information's there, and I think has been mentioned by Wendy and a few others. I get quite a lot of the newsletters and pick up on the info, and we put it into newsletters that we send out to our schools we work with. But sort of making it exciting for young people, trying to bring that into sessions, getting parents on board with that information without it just being something you read, is, I think, still the challenge, really, in some ways. And we reminisce in our group, because we were quite an old group, about the real game. I'll just sort of throw that out there. And a lovely new version of that I'm not creative, so I'm not going to create. Sort of, because it did sort of touch on labour market information in quite a good way, and I always found students enjoyed that. I'm not saying that's the perfect solution, but it's how we get young people to just have fun with labour market information. And it's like we do with everything we do with the careers, it's making it fun. It's not necessarily here's a career session, it's something they're having fun on those enterprise days, and you slip it in lots of careers information as you go along, and it's the same for LMI, really. So I'll leave that to Louise to do, basically, with the Careers Enterprise Company. Thanks,
Mark. Keith, you wanted to come in?
I guess my observation with that is, yes, it would be interesting to find creative ways for young people in schools and colleges to be able to interact with data and make sense of it. But I'm also curious how we go about connecting the passion that young people may have for a subject they're studying or an issue they're excited about and passionate about, for example, climate change and career opportunities in those spaces, and how the LMI piece is complementary. It supports that thinking through that decision-making process, as opposed to saying a climate change scientist earns £32,500 a year. They will change their career 5 times, and you need to get 3 A stars in science, maths, and chemistry in order to study that subject. I mean, you know, all that kind of information is interesting and helpful, but needs to tap into, I think, what young people are passionate about, what they're interested in, and so that the data drives that rather than, again, it being presented as a passive thing with which to engage.
I guess it links a little bit to the sort of idea of career competencies, doesn't it? That you're, and for adults as well, if you know what it takes to sort of be agile and think about your career, you're curious constantly about what's going on around you, about where things are changing, what skills are important, and building that curiosity, and it's a skill, isn't it, and a mindset, really, that often is the case. I'm wondering, we've been focusing quite a lot on young people. What about those of you working with adults and working in different settings? What any topics that you want to bring to this, or comments that came up in discussions? Perhaps not then, perhaps there aren't many people. I mean, I know Helen mentioned earlier about what she does with her clients. Okay, we've got 2 minutes left, so we are nearly up for time. But is there any final comment or insight anyone wants to share, or hope or request? Anyone? Well, I think it's been a very rich session, hasn't it, with lots of food for thought for those of you, myself included, who are sort of grappling with how to work with where things are heading, and people talk a lot about the VUCA world, don't they, because there's a lot of disruption around. Things might seem they're going to go one way, then they change, so there's that whole backdrop as well around this, about certain industries going out of favor, certain companies going out of favor overnight. All of this is happening as well, which impacts on the change. But it's a real skill, I think, to be sort of curious about this, as I was saying. And yeah, as someone's mentioned in the chat about how easy to change career, that's really relevant for people who are experienced and growing their careers. How can I move? What can I move to? How do I do it? Do I take, that's a big topic. And there are a lot of people wanting to change careers at different times. So it's very valid. So just one final thing to mention before we close. I'm going to do a little bit of a plug for the next NICEC event. Those of you who enjoy coming along to the NICEC sessions as well as CDI sessions, this is the next event, which is a topic that I think is very close to a lot of people's hearts around the whole, we hear a lot, don't we, about the career development profession and elevating its status and having a greater impact. So this session is looking at some research that's been looking at the whole, idea of setting up the career development practitioner as a chartered profession. So look out, that's on the NICEC website if you would like to join on the 23rd of May. So I think all I would like to say now is thank all our contributors for, I know quite a lot of preparation goes into these sessions, particularly when you're talking about labour market information. I know that Wendy, Emma, Charlie and Keith put quite a lot of thought into this this session, so we're very grateful to you for doing that. And I hope you found this cutting edge session really valuable, bringing the NICEC fellows to CDI career practitioners, and that mixture of discussion between research, themes and practice is a very important one. So I think the CDI will be sending out a survey, Ashley, I think. I'm not sure if you're putting that in the chat for people, or it might be an idea to put the link in the chat if you have it handy, or you'll get an email about that, and the slides will be uploaded into the CDI website, I believe. So thank you all very much. We've gone over by minutes, so I'm going to close the session off and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. All the best. Bye for now.